Today, the main issue that the military and the executive branch of our government face is the insurgency located in the Middle East concerning the War on Terror policy. In our specific time period, we are experiencing an era where we aim to fight terror.
However, some people are skeptical and suspicious of our intentions in the Middle East.
Furthermore, we should all question the justification of our involvement in foreign lands. How can we know that our military is doing the morally right thing so far away from home? Before we can answer such questions, we must understand the military policy of the United States through its history. We must comprehend the previous policies and their effectiveness to learn from our mistakes and to not repeat the past. In the beginning of our nation, the Continental Army's task was to liberate the people from the British Empire. This movement, the American Revolution, was greatly influenced by the Enlightenment era. The common people in the colonies wanted freedom from the British monarchs and demanded democracy and representation. Even though the odds were very uneven, the United States gained its independence after the battle in Yorktown,
with the help of the French Navy.
And so began the history of America. Not far from its rough beginning, the United States got involved in a new war, the War of 1812, with yet again Britain as the common enemy, just 30 years after its independence. The main reason why the United States got involved was to defend American sailors and naval trade routes with France. However, support from the American people was parted because the political parties at the time preferred either the British or the French. After the war, the country took a rapid twist due to the rise of nationalism in the country, which became known as the Era of Good Feelings. This led to the expansion to the West and was the birth of Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny was the main military policy of the United States from 1812 to 1861.
It was officially coined by John O'Sullivan in 1845.
This policy was about the expansion of the western border of the United States until the Pacific Ocean. This was clearly going to cause problems with our neighbor, as you can see right here. This expansion caused the Mexican-American War, which was originated due to the disagreement of the boundary line of Texas and Mexico's border. With the conclusion of the war, Mexico lost, and the United States' thirst for more land was increased. So the United States learned from the best and began to linger for overseas. However, the United States came into conflict over the issue of slavery. This was also a separation of party lines and governmental branches. With the result of Abraham Lincoln winning the 1860 election, it caused a split of northern and southern governments. Inner conflicts between the northern and southern congressmen were clearly present, as violence filled Congress during such times. This conflict would boil over into the U.S. Civil War, and inner turmoil would shatter the national defense policy throughout the war. Nevertheless, after the war, imperialism rose again for financial and territorial expansion. With the U.S. imperialism policy at its prime, it would eventually be challenged by another imperial power, the Spanish Empire. Before the war, William McKinley, the president at the time, was struggling with Congress, for he and Congress were debating whether if they should go to war or not.
Nevertheless, war was indeed declared.
Thus began the conflict that would become known as the Spanish-American War, in which the U.S. assisted Cuba in its fight to gain independence from Spain. The U.S. was interested in expanding its territory, of course, and acquired the Philippines from Spain during the war as its trophy. Carrying on from the idea of gaining overseas territories, the U.S. would totally peacefully annex Hawaii and conquer the Philippines,
even if it was against the natives' will.
This later became the Philippine-American War, which was a rather controversial conflict for the U.S. when it went against its own founding principles and became the oppressor that it sought to break away from so long ago. This imperial period from 1865 to 1918 was changed to isolationism from foreign conflicts. However, the United States was still dragged into World War I, even though Woodrow Wilson promised to keep the United States out of European conflict. After the end of World War I, the country returned to its isolationist policy during the Roaring 20s and the bankrupt 30s. However, this was changed with the beginning of World War II. The United States attempted to stay far away from this war again, yet they were drawn to fight after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
A date that will live in infamy.
This caused the U.S. to join the biggest, deadliest war in history. Such war demanded the entire country to support the war, a term known as total war. Furthermore, throughout the war, tensions began between the Allies, the United States and the USSR in particular. At the end, the USSR and the United States began to separate the world into factions that supported different philosophies. The next 40 years after World War II became known as the Cold War, which was the battle of capitalism and communism in different parts of the world. The policy that guided the Defense Department of the government was the domino effect. The main goal of the US was to stop the expansion of communism. Capitalism was supported by the United States and NATO, while communism was supported by the USSR and Warsaw Pact. These groups found battlegrounds in Latin America, the Middle East, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Furthermore, during Richard Nixon's presidency, Congress established the War Powers Resolution with the help of the Supreme Court. Gracefully, after the long, terrifying period of paranoia where the world could have ended with a push of a button, the conflict ended with the fall of the USSR and the Berlin Wall in 1989. After the military policy achieved its goal, the American military felt empty with no true goal. However, this ended soon when the terrorist attack occurred on September 11, 2001. The policy crafted after the attack,
as we have mentioned before,
is called the War on Terror, which mostly began in the Persian Gulf War, the operation of the UN to stop dictator Saddam Hussein. Furthermore, the US got involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. As part of the War on Terror, the main objective of the war was to establish a newer, more democratic regime. The last and the most current form of US military policy has consisted of the war in Afghanistan. The main objective of the US policy was to eliminate the terrorist influence and network in that region of the world. As such, the US is still embroiled in its goal for this part of its policy and continue to fight to make up ground.
However, some Americans, usually younger people, state that the true business of the US involvement in the Middle East is for resources. They are suspicious of American interaction and would rather have an isolationistic military policy in place.
And now that you understand the military policy of the United States and its history, as a democratic government, we, the people, are responsible to be aware of our government and its military actions. Therefore, I present you the question that I want you to consider and ponder about. Do you believe that our military's policy is truly virtuous?